Today, we're in the first chapter of 1 Samuel, and our focus is on Hannah and the promise she made to God. It was a big promise, a risky promise, and a promise we might struggle to keep ourselves. It reminded me of my own promise I made to God in a situation that, much like Hannah, I felt hopeless about. I had no control except the control of my thoughts, and I ended up eventually turning those thoughts over to the Lord on one of the most stressful days of my life. If you watched week 5, you might remember that I told you the story of the when and the how and the why I asked Mike to adopt a sibling group. Well, he said yes, and 6 months later, on June 26, 2001 to be exact, our court date to adopt 2 little girls had finally arrived. 2 trips to Russia, thousands of dollars spent, hours of paperwork and interviews had come to this very moment in time in a Russian courtroom when our prayers would finally be answered. We had only one job that particular Tuesday morning, and I thought it would be a relatively easy one. We were to go before a Russian judge and answer his questions about who we were and why we, as Americans, wanted to adopt these 2 little girls. It sounded simple enough, which is why when our Russian attorneys rehearsed us for what we were to say and how we were to say it, I thought it unnecessary. I mean, we were good people. We would tell the truth. And of course, the judge would be able to see us for who we were. Well, let me tell you, I couldn't have been more wrong. When we entered the room in the courthouse where we would have our trial, so to speak, we were surprised at the small shabbiness of the room. There were only 2 folding tables and folding chairs with 3 men sitting on one side, and a few chairs where we and our attorney sat facing them. Well, it was one of the hottest days of the summer, and the antiquated courthouse had no air conditioning. And even at 10 in the morning, it was already really, really hot. Mike was wearing a full suit and tie, and I felt sorry for him. It was good in that moment that we didn't know how long we would be in that little room or how hot it would get. We didn't speak Russian, of course, and so one of the 3 men was a translator. We were also told that the man in the middle was a judge, and we never did learn who the 3rd man was. The judge started his questioning with basic questions like our names and where we were from. Easy questions, easy answers. Well, I watched the judge closely and found him very formal and cold, and he actually looked angry and he looked bored. I didn't like what I saw at all. As the judge continued asking his questions, I found it strange that he never made eye contact with us. He kept his eyes on the papers in front of him, looking occasionally to the men to his right and left. I'm not sure he ever looked at us that day, ever really saw us, which might have been the oddest thing of the entire situation. So with his head down and his papers in front of him, the judge, through the translator, asked us question after question. Many of them asked repeatedly, but just in different ways. And as the morning went on and the hours ticked away, his questions turned to accusations. And he attacked our words in any way he could, trying his darndest to trip us up. It might have been the only time in my life when I processed every single word that came out of my mouth. The questions that stood out the most were those about our desire and our ability to provide for 2 additional children. Why would we want to adopt 2 more girls when we already had 2 of our own, he asked. Why would we want to spend money on them, he asked. Who would get our inheritance, he asked. He even asked if we would beat the girls. He could not seem to grasp our motives. He asked us if we'd be able to buy them a house or a car. I didn't dare tell him what I was really thinking, that I wouldn't be buying any kid of mine a house or a car. He asked us dozens and dozens of times in many different ways whether we really wanted the girls. He said he felt sorry for our poor girls at home who wouldn't get all of our attention and all of our money. And then we were grilled with what seemed like an hour over one small word written in our home study. And that word was the word A. Our home stated that we could afford a child from Russia. And because it wasn't clear that we could afford 2 children, he was stuck on what he called this great contradiction. Why would the paperwork say A and not 2? It might have been the most absurd hour of our entire lives. I did my best to hold it together and answer his ludicrous questioning, but as he continued to treat us less like parents and more like criminals, I started to get angry. It was all so surreal, like what was happening here? This was nothing like we expected. After 5 hours of questioning, yes, 5 hours, we were finally offered a break, and we gladly took it. Mike and I walked out into that hot, stuffy hallway, and I looked at Mike again, feeling sorry for him in his suit and tie. That small room had become sweltering. We made eye contact, but we were both too beaten down to even speak to each other, and we just walked to opposite corners of the hall to be by ourselves. I found an open window with no screen, and I looked up into a beautiful, bright, sunny sky. Such a sharp contrast to the dark heaviness of that courtroom. I felt scared. The judge clearly hated us, and I couldn't believe he was the one who was holding our family's future in his hands. In that moment, I had no doubt that he was going to deny us the girls. I don't think I've ever been as depleted in spirit as I was in that moment. And of course, I did the only thing I knew to do. I prayed. I asked the Lord for the girls, but in my heart, I felt all was lost. As I continued to pray, my desperation turned to a kind of submission. That's the only way I can describe it. I started giving control completely over to God. I told him it would be okay if we didn't get the girls. I needed God, and I guess I needed myself to know that Jesus would still be the Lord of my life, no matter the outcome. And this was the truth I spoke out loud at that window. I committed the girls to the Lord with or without them being in our family. And I said over and over again, Jesus is still Jesus, no matter what. Jesus is still Jesus, no matter what. That was the truth I was not willing to give up in the middle of my despair. It was in that moment I realized what surrender really is. It's not praying until God gives you what you want. Surrender is deciding God is still good and he's still God, even when he doesn't give you what you want. I started feeling a peace come over me standing there at that window. I was tired, I was sad, yet I felt the Spirit of God surrounding me. And I was ready to accept the judge's verdict, whatever that verdict might be. Mike and I were called back into the courtroom, and in only a couple of minutes, the judge read the decision without looking at us, and he granted us the adoption. And as quickly as he read the verdict, he picked up the phone, and in one disrespectful and dismissive act, it was all over. And our 5 grueling hours melted away. As a side note, we found out later that the judge was being watched by the government for corruption in Russia's adoption system, and we were his first case. And as our attorneys told us, the longest by many hours. We were not the only ones who had rehearsed that day. Surrender. I understand it because I've had to do it. I've had to surrender what I wanted in life so many times, not just that day in a Russian courtroom. This is what I see in Hannah. A woman surrendered. A woman who in her surrender gave her son to the Lord. A woman who in her surrender refused to have her face downcast. And a woman who will keep the most difficult promise anyone could ever make. Hannah's story in 1 Samuel is one we've seen before. It's about wanting children and not being able to have any. Year after year, Hannah is unsuccessful at getting pregnant. And year after year, Peninnah, the other wife of their husband Elkanah, has many sons and daughters. And like the battle of children between Leah and Rachel, it appears to be contentious on the part of the other wife. As scripture says, Peninnah kept provoking Hannah in order to irritate her, going as far as provoking her until Hannah cries and stops eating, is what scripture says. 1 Samuel 1:10 says Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And in verse 11, she makes a vow to God, O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire life, and as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. As I searched out this phrase, Lord of heaven's armies, I found Hannah was the first person to address God in this way. She's calling on the all-powerful God. She knows God can do anything he chooses to do. In Hannah's prayer, she makes an if-then statement. It's a biggie of a statement. She says, if you give me a son, then I will give him back to you, and he will be yours for his whole life. This is Hannah's vow to God. Hannah's promise. This kind of trade with God doesn't come across like she's bargaining, however, or only trying to get what she wants. It comes across as relinquishing a claim on something that would never really be hers to begin with, a sort of pre-surrender. If you give me a son, God, I won't forget that he's yours and not mine. Hannah's not negotiating with God. She's surrendering to him. She isn't saying, give me a son and I'll repay you. She's saying, if you give him to me, I won't pretend that he belongs to me. Eli the priest is sitting by the doorpost of the Lord's house watching Hannah's lips move in prayer, because scripture tells us she was praying in her heart and not out loud. Eli thinks Hannah is drunk, and because of her odd behavior, he also thinks she's praying to the evil one. But Hannah reassures Eli she's not drunk, but in great distress. Eli tells Hannah, may the God of Israel grant your request. I find this interesting because Eli doesn't know the request, as her words weren't spoken out loud, yet he must know God is with Hannah, because he affirms her request and he tells her to go in peace. And after this happens, Hannah is no longer distressed. It says her face is no longer downcast. And what happens next is that Hannah gives birth to a son in due time. We don't know exactly what in due time means or when it happened, but we know all things happen in God's timing. And so Hannah, in God's perfect timing, has a son named Samuel. We can only imagine how happy Hannah must have been. The name Samuel means God has heard, or I asked of God. Right from the start, Hannah remembers God. Hannah doesn't forget her vow that if God gives her a son, she's going to give him back to God for his entire life. Hannah tells Elkanah, after the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. As parents, some days can be very long, but we all know how fast the years pass, and I can only guess how Hannah must have looked longingly at the days and the weeks and the months which were passing so quickly, knowing what was ahead of her. Weaning happens in this time period between the ages of 2 and 4, probably closer to 3 years old. I don't know about you, but I might not have weaned that child until he was 12 years old. But the thief of time arrives, and Samuel is weaned, and it's now time for Hannah to honor her vow. Hannah and Elkanah travel to the house of Shiloh so they can give Samuel to Eli the priest. Hannah says in 1 Samuel 1:28, "Now I am giving him to the Lord, and he will belong to the Lord his whole life." This verse ends with, "And he worshiped the Lord there." Some translations say this is Samuel worshiping the Lord, or it could be his parents. But whoever it was, there's no downcast spirit found here, no bitter crying, only worship of God. This is what we find as we enter the second chapter of 1 Samuel. Instead of a mother lamenting over the loss of her 3-year-old son, we find a mother rejoicing in prayer. If you haven't read the prayer of Hannah, it's worth reading. I debated doing commentary on her prayer because it's so powerful. But the sentence I want to highlight, which I think is the foundation of Hannah's prayer, is found in 1 Samuel 2:8 and 9, when Hannah prays, "For all the earth is the Lord's, and he has set the world in order. God will guide the feet of his faithful servants." The first prayer was spoken in Hannah's heart. But this prayer, after Samuel is given over to God, is one she speaks out loud. And it's filled with praise of God. It's an incredible story. The giving and the taking, the grief and the joy, the despair and the hope. And through it all, Hannah shows us a foundational faith in God. She knows that all the earth is God's, and it's God who sets the world in order. I don't want us to miss that Samuel is anointed. He's being set apart for God himself. The future for Samuel will be a holy one. He'll live and grow up in Shiloh under the training and guidance of Eli, the highest priest in the land. Samuel will live in the tabernacle surrounded by the Ark of the Covenant. This is like training directly under Charles Spurgeon or Billy Graham. Hannah's surrender to God is what secured the future of her son, even as she couldn't see and didn't know how the journey would end. When I stood at that open window in a Russian courthouse, feeling my own despair, what I didn't understand at first was that God was not wanting me to trust him after the verdict. He was wanting me to trust him before the verdict. Surrender is not proven when God answers your prayers. It's proven when he might not. It was such a defining moment in my faith as I learned to trust that Jesus is still Jesus, no matter what. Samuel is to become the faithful prophet all of Israel will see. But before there was a faithful prophet, there was a surrendered mother, a mother who God sees when no one else does. I'll see you next week.